So you've got an amazing podcast, great guests, edited to perfection, but no one's listening, or not as many people as you'd like. So what do? You can't just improve your content, because if people don't know you exist, they're not going to hear it anyway. So what's the point? What you need is a proper podcast marketing plan. But where to start? That's what you're going to learn in today's episode. Fiona Fraser is the founder of the UK's first and only podcast PR agency, POW PR. She's worked on podcasts including Zoe, Goalhanger's The Rest Is series, and 2 Kew Gardens podcasts, so she knows what she's talking about, and trust me that she's got a lot of wisdom to share in this episode today. I'm Ollie Kew, founder of podcast production company OG Podcasts. Thank you very much for joining me. So I was lucky enough to catch up with Fiona, who shared some of her secrets to success and how you can start marketing your podcast today, even without putting any money down. Enjoy. I want to dive in with a big question. What is your number one tip for increasing a podcast's visibility?
Well, I'm going to say PR, aren't I? Obviously. Being the podcast PR expert. But I'm not saying that just because that's what I do, genuinely. I think this is such an untapped resource. And I've been on quite a journey in the past 4 years with doing what I do. I've gone from just being like coming out of television, falling into podcasting, and then more the last year especially, really tracking just the kind of successes that it can bring. So the reach that you get from PR, for example, compared to ads and things like that, is that it's off the scale when you get the results. It can be like obviously a risky business, like, you know, nothing's guaranteed. But when you do get results, the ROI for PR compared to ads is just like, you can't compare them. And the thing about like what you're saying about the visibility aspect is like what you're doing with PR is trying to create genuine talkability and credibility, because you're building like an authority when people write about you. And now we all know the difference between an ad and like someone saying, guys, this is a really good thing. So it's worth its weight in gold when you can get that kind of visibility and get people talking about you in a positive way.
In terms of PR, what does it actually mean to do PR for your podcast? For anybody who doesn't quite understand what exactly it is that you're doing for them.
No, I have to do a lot of education around PR because so coming from TV, I was working in-house and everyone got it, and it was kind of a shock to the system for me coming out and being like, what do you mean you don't understand PR? So that's something now I'm used to having to explain, especially in the podcast world where people they haven't done it before. So I do work for a lot of independent podcasters in that position, and they haven't even thought about PR. So I welcome the chance to talk about it and what it means. So for me, getting PR is getting your podcast featured in the press, in the media. So that media can be the Guardian's newsletter talking about the best podcast of the week. It could be if you're, like, for example, just before I came on this call, we were confirming a local BBC News outlet to go on a walk with a birdwatcher podcaster that we're working with. So that's PR, so let's get them onto TV. We work with people to get them onto like Radio 4 shows, featured in magazines like Countryfile. We get people onto, and then they get picked up on Apple News. So these are the kind of opportunities that we're getting across a real range of press. So traditional media, I'm talking about TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, and online. For us, online is like always the kind of like priority because we want those click-throughs, right? So we want people to click straight through to the podcast and without any hesitation, because obviously with podcast discoverability being the kind of the biggest problem, if you see it in the paper, you've still got to then go and actually put it into your app to find the podcast, which is work. So I love it when people can just click through and, it comes up, because if they're on their phone, it will go to the app. If they're on the computer, they've probably got the app, Spotify or Apple installed to take them there. So that's PR in a nutshell. It's like getting, and it can range from like someone reviewing your podcast and just saying, this is a great podcast, go and listen, to you being interviewed about the podcast, to also you being interviewed about something that's in relation to the podcast. So if your podcast, for example, is about bird watching, which is sort of think about it now, then it might be we'd say, what bird should we be looking out for this autumn, for example. That's like a pitch in itself for PR, to go and encourage people to get out for walks and go and look for birds. It might be that I really don't know if this is true, by the way. It might be there are specific birds to be looking out for in September. So we're always looking for kind of new angles like that as well to pitch that are relevant to the time of year, the news cycle. And then we also do reactive press, where we'll respond to stuff that's actively happening in the media. So people looking for experts on particular subjects. So all of our campaigns will kind of do a really broad range of PR.
What I would like to know is, you sort of mentioned the difference between adverts. So, paying to have an advert on Instagram maybe, or paying to have an advert on one of the listening apps. You might be able to get yourself a Spotify advert, 30 seconds, where you can shout about your podcast, versus PR, and why PR tends to be more effective. And I think one of the biggest complaints around doing paid ads is the click through. People say, you see an ad on Instagram, it's unlikely that then you're going to go off platform to another platform in order to listen to the podcast. So you put a lot of money down, you don't get a huge return on that investment. So why is PR a better option? And do you see that people are clicking through more frequently? Have you sort of got a gauge or a measure of that?
So for me, it's hard to measure with the click through, because I don't know about what the average click through is for ads. So obviously that's a whole other world in terms of like, there will be an average, but like in terms of podcasts, what should you expect? So I'd want to know specifically, what we're measuring up against. What I would say is, like, when you were talking about ads with like Instagram versus podcasts, I see them as really separate. So when it comes to like you say, going off platform from Instagram, generally that is quite a very common issue, is that people are just like, they'll see it and it's kind of okay for awareness building. And if you think about, like, so when I worked in TV, you had BBC, for example, you had huge marketing departments, and they were always working towards these 7 sort of touch points for people to become aware of a new TV show, for them to then go, I'm going to go and watch this. So it could be like them seeing it on Instagram is one touch point that could be good. The problem for me is they're not naturally going to then fall across it somewhere else in the way you would a TV show. So unless they take that action there and then, it's going to be really hard for them to come back and find you, because trying to get them to remember it is going to be so difficult. So
and listening to a podcast isn't an impulse decision, is it? Because
no,
it's not like watching a reel on Instagram or a YouTube short or something where it's 60 seconds and done. You can make that impulse click. Like, for me at least, and I think for a lot of people, you have to really give it some thought before you commit, because you're there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 hours, depending on the podcaster, and you think, do I want to spend this time with them? And do I have that time right now to spend with them? And the likelihood is, if anyone's like me and, they're on the toilet looking at their Instagram feed, it's just not the time to listen to a podcast.
No, not with 2 kids. You haven't got that sort of time.
No.
Definitely not. I think, you're right. It's about being in the right headspace, because what you want to do is you want them to click through, follow it, and then have it ready. So when they're like going for a walk or going to the gym or wherever you listen to your podcast, it's there and ready straight away. That's what you want. So you want people to be like, follow us now, not listen now. So again, the call to action should be quite different, I think, in that situation.
So PR, in a sense, then, the way I'm understanding it, is that it's about building your presence and authority over a period of time, so that everywhere people look, you are there, especially relevant to your niche. Someone looks at a Guardian article because it's something that they're interested in, that they see your podcast there. They look on another newspaper because it's still, that's still a subject that they're interested in. Oh, hey, you're there too. And over time,
Right.
they start to associate you with that field and that niche, and they go, maybe I will give their podcast a chance. So it's not necessarily about that instant click through, but it's that authority building.
No, and this brings me to a really good point, actually. So thank you for the nice setup on that, because essentially, what I love about PR over ads as well is they live forever, whereas ads literally just die and that's it, they're gone. And it's like, you could place a PR piece and then 2 years later it could still be working for you. And I'm just like, isn't that what we all want? Just have all these sort of like footprints everywhere that are really positive, talking about our show that just keeps driving people back. And then the reach of that over time, like we'll do a report at the end of a campaign, and generally our reach is in the millions. And the spend with us compared to ads for that is off it's off the scale. Like we cost nothing compared to like what it would cost to get that kind of reach through ads. So the fact that we achieve it organically, it lives forever. You can then start to use the PR that we get, or PR that you get for pitching for sponsorship, pitching for bigger guests, and applying for awards. You can win awards off the back of PR. So stuff then starts to work hard for you. You put it on your website. You say featured in the Guardian, featured in the Times, featured so and so. You could even add it to your kind of info on platform, because people will automatically be like, oh wow, this must be good if the Times are saying XYZ. If you've got a good review, you can put it on your information and stuff everywhere. So it then just continually works for you beyond the initial publication in multiple ways. Whereas an ad, literally, if you're not paying for it, it's gone and that's it. And everyone knows it's an ad as well.
That brings me on to a good point, because a lot of the people who'd be watching this, who'd be listening to this, are probably smaller podcasts, maybe people who don't have a load of money to throw at their show yet, or maybe they haven't built up an online influence yet. So what would be your advice to them in terms of doing some grassroots PR for themselves? Like, what goes into pitching to one of these organizations? How do you come up with a pitch that will work and that they'll accept?
I think the thing is everything's like a balance of time or money, isn't it? So it's time exhaustive to pitch to press. We have I've got a team now of a big team, and we all work on different parts of campaigns, because it's so we're sending out a lot of emails, not spam. We research our press lists exhaustively so that we're sending them to the right people. That's the first thing I would say is don't spam people. Start with 10, maybe find 10 journalists that are writing about the thing that you talk about or that would genuinely be interested in your podcast. And then write them personalised pitches where you're just, telling them about what the podcast is, its successes, why they should be interested in featuring it, and what you've got to kind of offer them. So for me, having the press release to assist that is always going to put you above everybody else. So it's just having a press release is a real asset. You can it can just keep working for you. If you do the work and getting a press release right to position your podcast, and then you can just rewrite your pitch and keep that short every time, so that it's specific to each person that you're contacting. And you can have as much success pitching directly as we can. I feel that there's this thing where people think, oh, well, journalists don't want to hear from me. They do. And that actually, sometimes they want to hear more from you than me about your podcast. So there is
Yeah, well, I'm a former BBC journalist, and I loved receiving good pitches because, when you're putting out daily news programs or entertainment shows, you are starved for content. It's not easy coming up with stories. When someone presents you on a golden platter or silver platter or whatever, this perfect pitch, and you think this is amazing.
Yes.
Actually, that's a relief, because it means your days just got easier. But what I think I discovered from a lot of the PR pitches that were coming into us from a radio station point of view were that they sort of missed the mark a lot of the time. They were really easy to skip over because they didn't give me a good top line. Maybe somewhere buried deep in the story, there was something really useful I could have turned into a top line, but you'll constantly go as a journalist. Yeah, and you've just got to move on to the next thing if that doesn't sit with you straight away, because you've got a lot of shows and a lot of content to put out. So is it about, for that individual podcaster who's looking to start pushing out their show, is it about finding a top line and like finding the right sell for the journalist?
So it's always working backwards, because the way you do it is you have a press release that tells the whole story, like you say, it's probably got multiple lines in it of interest, and then your email will then have like for that one line for that one journalist that's like really punchy, and then your actual subject of the email is the punchiest ever. If you're writing to local press, for example, it would be like, so I just did one this week that's like, Kent podcast reaches 1 million downloads. Because for Kent press, they'll be like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. And 1 million downloads is a big number, isn't it, for an independent podcaster? That's really impressive. So I've got two in one subject line. I've already got two hooks. They're from Kent and they've got 1 million downloads for their podcast. Then in the pitch, I tell them what the podcast is about. So this one particularly was like it's historical true crime, but it's comedy, and they also have it in a cocktail.
Okay.
It's a lot of elements, so it's really, really different. And then, to talk about the fact how long, they've hit 1 million downloads, they're doing really well, they're growing big in the US. Let me know you want to speak to the hosts. And I tell them like which area of Kent they live in, just because they kind of would want to know that. So even if you just start with local press first, sometimes just to like get your confidence going of how it works. Local press, especially outside of London, I'm London, so local press doesn't work as well in London, but outside of London, local press love anything that's going on interesting where they are. Like, so if you've got something good and to talk about, especially in a local area, that's a perfect way to get started, is with local press. And then beyond that, I would say like niche press. So if your podcast is about cars, like go and find websites about cars, and going niche sometimes gets you the ball rolling. And then you might build up the confidence to go for bigger titles that you would love to be featured in, like The Guardian or whatever.
How important is it that you start to think of PR in the early days of your podcast? Say you're in the prep stages, you haven't even released an episode, or maybe you're just a few episodes in. Are people going to care about what you're doing enough to feature you? And is that something you should be pitching for before you've even launched your show?
So we really are launch specialists. So the kind of I'd say like 80% of the work that we do is around launching. And for an independent podcast, especially, you're only new once and you're launching once. So to miss out on that kind of moment of newness is really upsetting, because you're just make the most of it, like put the work behind it. So the program that I run around this, we sort of would always say build in, like you might think, oh, it's going to take me 3 months to launch my podcast, but give yourself at least a month to promote it as well. So a lot of the people I work with will do things on a quarterly basis. So it might be they spend three months making a podcast, then 3 months working on their kind of marketing, and then the PR starts to happen maybe 6 weeks, 4 weeks out. So that's about the timeline for me to start pitching to people. But what I would say is you want stuff to run around launch, but never before, ever before, because you don't want to lose any opportunities for those click-throughs. So embargo everything. If you don't know what an embargo is, that just means you tell press nothing can run until launch date, and that's a really normal thing to work with. So they would understand that and they would work with you on it. So you have that power to say anything you're pitching is embargoed until XYZ date. And so you're holding back the news essentially, because otherwise, if something runs and your podcast isn't live or your feed's not set up, you're going to completely miss out on click-throughs, which is just very upsetting as well, isn't it?
Have you ever worked with a podcaster who's been sitting around maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, sitting around the low hundreds, and then PR has made a substantial difference? Like, what, I know it's really hard to sort of figure out what the metrics are like, and it's going to be different for each podcaster. But what sort of growth do you see happening within a podcast once you do start marketing it this way?
I guess what we really focus on is reputation of the podcast for our campaigns. So we help you build assets through a campaign that then get you to the next bit. So rather than saying, okay, we've got 200 listeners now, we want PR to get us to 10,000. That's not going to happen, by the way. But it might get you. We do see some chart success from PR. We just had a podcast launch that's, the numbers are not huge, but they went into number 4 in the charts week of launch, which is pretty impressive to be a top 10 podcast.
Yeah.
So isn't it? So it's great. So they get to then go and say that that's something that's, ongoing, and they can sort of claim that credit, and they can build all this stuff out to then like I say, it's always about the next step rather than like what's happening right now. Like, what are we working towards? So whenever I talk to somebody, at the start of a project, it's like, where are you trying to go with this? Because then that's where we will try and like build you assets and get the results that will help get you there. And yes, it's, you're going to say it's listens, but why though? Why do you want the listens? So what can happen? Because the question is not about building the listeners, it's building the listeners so that I can X, Y, Z, which is going to be monetize my podcast, get sponsorship, make this more of a job. To which my answer is like, use PR to also support you do that.
Do you have to be saying something new in order for a news outlet to pick you up? Like, is there... Because I'm wondering whether like your top line needs to be some sort of revelation from your guest that maybe hasn't been in the news elsewhere. But, that's tricky in podcasting because half the time you're interviewing people who have already been interviewed in other podcasts, other media. So finding like a new top line in the same way like a journalist might is probably quite tricky, especially for indie podcasters. So I'm just wondering how new it has to be.
So when it comes to guests, you shouldn't rely on your guests for your PR stuff as an indie podcaster. Like speaking from vast experience, like the only times that it works is if someone is revealing like, significant new information on a subject, like a medical expert or something like that, and they've got research that they're talking about. Or one, I'll work with podcasts that have like quite big names and celebrities. And then, so we'll do a news release on those and then put those lines out. Now they will, and generally they get picked up, but sometimes they don't. Depends how big the celebrity is. So I wouldn't rely on your guests for your PR.
That's interesting. So does that mean that you should take on more of a thought leadership position when you are interviewing a guest or creating a narrative where you are having not necessarily equal share in the episode, but maybe a 40-60 split where you are talking and giving your thoughts as much as possible, allowing your guest to have room to speak too, but you are one of the reasons people are coming back to the podcast. You're not just sort of a question master.
Yeah, so I think this is the thing where people get caught up in the guest side of things as well, is like people do come back to podcasts for the host, not the guest. So the host does need to be involved. But at the same time, for us, if you came to us to do a PR campaign and you had a host that wasn't an expert in the subject of the whole series, we would struggle to get PR because what would they talk about? So there has to be some sort of alignment there. But I think I wouldn't rely on one sort of guest episode to get your PR. I'd rather build out the profile of the host as the expert generally in what they're talking about.
Yeah, and to me, to remain committed to a podcast that you are creating, I think you need to find a balance between what you're knowledgeable about and what you're passionate about anyway, because I think it's a surefire way, and I speak about this in another video, but it's a surefire way to kill your podcast or force you to quit if you're in a space where you aren't actually that knowledgeable, because eventually your knowledge in the field just dries up, it runs out, you have nothing new to add and nothing new to say, and you become highly reliant on your guests. So it's a really That's a really interesting point that you make. I wonder, when it comes to guesting, how I saw you post on LinkedIn, for people who don't necessarily have a podcast or the resources to start their own show yet, that it's a good idea to guest on people's podcasts if you want to start building up your authority and build up your brand identity. But I wonder, does it also work the same for people who do have shows?
Yeah.
Whether should they be guesting on other people's podcasts as well? And can those be PR opportunities?
Oh, 100%. I mean, being a guest is the PR opportunity in and of itself. And for me, this is the quickest win you can do PR wise, is to be a guest on other podcasts, because getting those cross promotion opportunities, they're so successful. So it's just a no brainer to be doing it. So I love, in part of our campaign would always include podcasts, but essentially if you're pitching yourself to press, you should also just be pitching to other podcasts as well. And it might be you offer them a collaboration opportunity back to promote them in some way. It depends how you work it, but definitely that should be one of the first things you think about, actually, probably above paying for ads, or for sure. And even when it comes to media, it's like definitely attack podcasts like as quick as possible and pitch to those for opportunities, because that is a PR opportunity.
And is that a similar approach you would take to like the PR that you've been talking about so far, pitching to magazines and newspaper journalists? Is it the same kind of thing you need to do when you're putting towards other podcast opportunities?
It pretty much is. So you could still, if you've got a press release, you could still use that. And again, it's all about doing the kind of personal research, personal pitching. And what I'd say is that with any pitch, think about the value that you're offering that person. It's always about the value that you're bringing to them, the value that you're bringing to their audience. It's not about you. So you just want to come across as someone that's like offering them lots of things. And if you can offer them, if you can say, I'll share you on my Instagram, I'll share you on my newsletter as well, and things like that. So you build up their audience as a result, like even better. So whatever you can add in to sort of make it a no-brainer for them, that's what I would do. So go in with one sort of thing to talk about and make sure it's relevant. Like if you're a podcast host, you'll know if you've been pitched to and been like, why is this person sending me this? This is like so not relevant. Just make it relevant. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and from personal experience, there's nothing worse than receiving what just feels like a generic pitch that's being sent out to everybody. So that personalization message that you're putting out there, I think, is really, really important. So I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. It's about sponsorships and how PR helps you land sponsorships, I guess down to credibility. But what is the difference that it makes in terms of approaching sponsors down the line? How is it helping to fund your show in that way?
So the training that I give on this means that you use PR as like an asset for your sponsorship deck. And we've got like a template that people can use essentially to then like drop in PR, because it people will see that and just be like, wow, they've been featured in all these places, they must be amazing. It just gets you over that line of it's building that trust basically. And then you could put links to it, any of the coverage you've had. And then the other way round is if you're doing a PR campaign for your podcast, when you go to sponsors, you can tell them that, and then they can be like talked about in the press release. They could be featured, to press that way. So then they're also getting PR from your PR. It's another selling point essentially for the sponsorship as well, which can be really attractive to sponsors.
Does it mean with a PR focus in that launch stage of your podcast and actually building it into the strategy, and hopefully everybody listening to this will now start to think of that as part of the process to launching their show? Do you think it helps you land a sponsor before you actually publish your first episode? Is that possible?
Yeah, it is possible. This is my big thing I'm going to be like harping on about for the next 3 months probably, because I've got my training coming out with a template with it in the next sort of week or two, which is like pitch for sponsorship before you even press record. Like, you can do that. I don't know why people don't think they can do that. It's this really weird thing that people think they have to wait. And I'm like, no, you can just do it. I've literally helped someone just do it. And I was working with them one-to-one, and then they couldn't believe it when they went to a sponsor and they got the whole thing paid for, plus a launch event, plus some extra. So they made money off it. And you're like, yeah, because if people want to be associated with you, they'll pay to be associated with you. You just need to make it a really enticing offer. And you, as the host, need to understand the process, not them as the sponsor. This is the important things. This is what I'm trying to help people with my training. It's like, this is how you go and position it. Because you need to turn up and go, this is what we're offering, this is what you get, this is what it costs, X, Y, Z. Because people won't understand. Otherwise, they're like, well, I don't understand what you're asking me to do. Like, how much is it? What do I get? So it's just going in there really confidently with that ability to kind of pitch. Again, it all comes down to the pitch. This is what I do, pitching. And you can do that before you start your recording. You can do that after you've recorded. You can then go around and sort of give people a listen and say, here's the series, we're looking for a sponsor. You can do it after you're up and running. There's no point that you can't do it. This is what I'm trying to say. Like, whatever stage you're at, you can pitch for a sponsorship. It's all going to come down to the fact that you've got a good idea, a good podcast idea people want to get behind, and you're showing them how you're going to market, how you're going to grow an audience. That's it.
And I think when it comes to like a limited series, for instance, that becomes more important than ever, because you've got this limited run, especially if you want to do some baked in, host read adverts, and not just you don't want just dynamic stuff. You want something which feels like a series sponsor. That work has to go in ahead of time, because it's not something that's so easily done retrospectively. So I think especially anyone listening now who thinks I want to do an 8-part series, 10-part series, I think it sounds like your course is one to pick up. Tell me a little bit about that course and how people can get a hold of it.
So if they head to my website, thepodcastexpert.co.uk, all of my sort of training is there that the people can access immediately. The sponsorship one will be there by the end of August. So I've just given it exclusively to my program. I just want people to have a go at it, and now it's ready for public consumption, which is very exciting.
Very exciting.
I want to see people, if they go and make money from their podcast. This is my big mission, Ollie, is that we make the industry profitable. Like, you and me are fortunate enough that we're in work. Like we were just talking before we started, we're in work from the industry. Work is available. Eyes are on the industry. People want access to it. I've been in rooms where like huge brands and banks and all this, like, they want to go, how do we access to podcasts? We know that the action people take from it is huge. So this is part of my mission, is like, let's just get this ball rolling for people and like not overcomplicate the process. So for me, this was the kind of quickest way I could help people like get started with that. And I only ever launch things like that when I know that it's been successful. So I'm not just talking because this just hasn't happened. Like, this has happened this year to people I've worked with. I know it's one of those things that's like, feels like a really weird thing to get your head around, but with money, when you're like a creator, but you need to start thinking about your podcast as a business if you want it to make you money. And that involves having conversations around money. So I think people get so scared even just to say the word like money.
And people also get this, they have this fear that somehow looking at your podcast as a business is going to strip away the creativity.
No.
It's going to make you feel less creative. But actually, I learned this lesson from a client who is in the publishing world and deals with creatives all the time. And he said, actually, looking at your podcast as a business and treating it that way allows you to be more creative, because you are able to fund those creative endeavors. Whereas you're just going to shoot yourself in the foot if you don't look at it that way, because there is inevitably going to be a time when it just comes to an end because it's not making you money. It's not doing anything for your brand. It's not worth continuing. So actually you're funding future creativity. No, exactly.
That is such a good point, actually. And like all of the creative industries, by the way, are built on money. Like,
Yeah.
how do you think they like? It doesn't need, if you find the right sponsor as well. You don't need to it doesn't need to impact your creativity. God, that was such a bad pronunciation. Creativity. I've been talking for a while now. I'm dropping my tears. It doesn't need to impact your creativity. So this is my big dream for people, is that they can start to, because I meet so many amazing indie podcasters that are on that brink where they're kind of got a really good show, they're getting decent listens, they might have won an award or two, and they're like, I just don't know where to take this. It's cost me so much money and time, and it's like, right, don't go and start asking people for money. Just do it now and see what happens. You just don't know unless you try.
You've mentioned working with indie podcasters, you've mentioned working with big brands. And for anybody who's thinking, okay, I love the sound of this PR stuff, but actually, as a solo podcaster, I can't be bothered. I would rather pay somebody like you to do it. They've got some funding somewhere. What sort of budgets do you work with, and what is it that you do which would be different to what somebody could do by themselves?
So I think when people say they can do it by themselves, I've been at this for 18 years, so I'm obviously really experienced in what I do, and also know the time it takes, the just the pure volume of activity it takes to run a campaign. So I think people would just underestimate that. And look, what I would say is, if you do want to do it yourself, like, at least set yourself a target of maybe like outreaching to 5 people a month, whether that's podcast or press, and you just keep doing that to build up momentum. What I see is people just stop doing that. So when you work with us, it's like either 3 months or 5 months of us just going at it constantly with pitching for you to secure these opportunities that they might run within the 3 months work of us. They might run beyond that. We quite like leaving you opportunities that are going to run later on, because you will then continue to get these nice little growth spikes after work of us, and then you'll think, oh, POW PR are great. So we enjoy that, because we also want stuff. You need that cycle of things down the line to give you that growth, those little growth opportunities and promotion opportunities. So like, it's an always on thing, promoting your podcasts. So it's whether or not, like my PR agency is called POW PR, obviously, and then when I do more the training stuff, it's as the podcast expert. So I'm quite kind of split in how I work. So I try and give people the right approach for them, depending on where they're at, essentially.
Yeah, so it's very similar to what I offer other podcasters by producing their show in the background and doing the research and doing the editing. You're giving them the energy, the expertise, and also just that ability to keep on going, because otherwise, and the volume of traffic, that ability to just pump out all of these press releases, that's just something that a single person is never going to be able to achieve or keep up or keep the motivation for. So what you're offering really is just a chance to make it a viable part of your strategy for in the long term.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'm saying it is hard work. Like, it's hard work for us as a team. We wake up every day and they're just like, here we go again, because you're just like, you're always setting yourself up to fail every day, because the volume of emails you have to send compared to responses you get is so high or low. I'm not sure which way around now I've said it. You get a very low number of responses, but that's also okay. You just need to accept that that's what happens. And it could be that a journalist that I've known for 10 years, like, they'll ignore me, like 20 emails from me, not about the same person. I would never email someone 20 times about the same person. But they'll ignore, 20 podcasts that I'm working on, for example, over 6 months. And then they'll respond to the one that they are interested in. Do I get upset with them about that? No. They're busy. They're not interested. When they say yes, perfect. And I maintain my relationships with the podcast press even tighter, because I know that means when they get an email from me, they're going to open it. And they've told me that themselves. Like, if they see my name pop up, they're like, let's see what they're working on today, because they know we only sign people with good shows. It's building those personal relationships is important, but I think people can go on about that a lot, and like, most people don't have time for personal relationships. They just want to know like what the story is. Does it fit with what they're working on? That's it. Simple as that. Don't overcomplicate it.
One final point I just want to raise is you mentioned that you only work with good shows.
Yeah.
And that's important, right? That's the fundamental behind this. Like, if you are going to put the energy into your show and into pushing out for press,
Yeah.
like it, at the end of the day, it has to be good as well. Like, it doesn't matter how much press you get if what you're putting out is just not hitting the mark. So fundamentally, it does boil down to content and what you're putting out and how you're preparing your show.
I said this yesterday to somebody. I was like, I've been leading a horse to water for 18 years. Because that's all I can do. Is like, I can get people to you. Then what happens beyond that point is down to you. It's like, I've brought you the people. Like, you need to then convert them into like fans, because I can't make them listen to your podcast and love it and want to listen to it again and again and again. But this, part of that is like when we work with people, because we are a boutique agency, we have very limited capacity in who we work with, is we vet people in advance, obviously. So we'll make sure they've got all their stuff, like all their stuff online is set up how they need to look. They've got a good profile so that when journalists click through, immediately they'll get what they're about, and we'll tell people the things they need to work on. If we think they've got a good podcast, but they're not set up online well, and can sort of sort that out before we start working with them. Because why would we want to send lots of, potentially millions of people to you, and then they're just like, this website's terrible, or stuff doesn't look good? Like, that would be ridiculous.
It's a very good point. Well made. Well, Fiona Fraser, I am constantly amazed about how far you're progressing, how big your business is building, and I'm really impressed with what you're doing out there, especially as one of the few people doing podcast PR in the UK. So very, very much appreciative of your time, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So have you had any success with podcast PR, or maybe marketing your show in another way? Let me know in the comments and we can all share in your successes. I'm Ollie Kew from OG Podcasts. I'll see you next time.